The torch weighed exactly 3.5 pounds, but in Muhammad Ali's trembling hands, it felt like the weight of redemption itself. 85,000 people had risen to their feet in Atlanta's Olympic Stadium, their collective breath held in suspension as the greatest athlete of the 20th century stood 30 feet above them, his body betraying him even as his spirit prepared for one final moment of transcendence. 3 hours earlier, in the labyrinthine tunnels beneath the stadium, Ali had received the torch from Janet Evans with hands that couldn't stop moving. The Olympic swimming champion had looked into his eyes and seen something that the cameras couldn't capture, not weakness, not defeat, but the quiet intensity of a man preparing for a battle that would be fought entirely within the confines of his own nervous system. The Parkinson's disease had been stealing pieces of him for 12 years now, taking his voice first, then his coordination, then his ability to move through the world with a fluid grace that had once made him seem like he was dancing even when standing still. But tonight, July 19th, 1996, the disease would have to wait. Tonight, Ali had one more performance to give, one more moment to prove that greatness could transcend the limitations of flesh and bone. In the holding area beneath the stadium, his wife Lonnie had watched him practice the simple motion of raising the torch, her heart breaking and swelling simultaneously as she witnessed him fight for control over muscles that had once moved with the precision of a master artist's brush. Each practice lift was a small victory against a progressive deterioration that had been quietly winning battles inside his brain for over a decade. His right hand shook in small, involuntary tremors that sent ripples through the Olympic flame he held aloft. The torch's silver surface caught the stadium lights and threw fractured reflections across his face, highlighting the concentration lines that had deepened around his eyes as he fought to control muscles that no longer obeyed his commands. Every second required conscious effort, every movement a small victory against a neurological rebellion that made simple actions feel like complex choreography. The crowd's roar when it first appeared on the platform had been unlike anything he had experienced, even in his fighting days. This wasn't the partisan energy of boxing fans choosing sides, wasn't the hostile tension of press conferences where his political views had made him a target. This was something purer, more universal. The sound of humanity recognizing one of its champions struggling against impossible odds and choosing to witness rather than look away. The stadium fell into a silence so complete that the only sounds were the distant hum of television cameras and the soft whisper of wind moving through 85,000 held breaths. This wasn't the raucous energy of a boxing crowd hungry for violence. This was something rarer, more sacred, the moment when sport transcended entertainment and became pure human drama, unscripted and uncontrollable. Ali could feel every eye in the stadium focused on his trembling hands, could sense the television cameras zooming in to capture the involuntary movements that had become the visible signature of his condition. But instead of shame, he felt something unexpected, a strange kind of peace with being seen exactly as he was, without the mask of athletic invincibility or political defiance that had defined his public persona for 3 decades. The weight of the moment pressed down on him like atmospheric pressure before a storm. This wasn't just about lighting a flame. This was about completing a journey that had begun in 1960 when an 18-year-old Cassius Clay had won Olympic gold in Rome and thrown his medal into the Ohio River in protest of racial segregation. 36 years later, Muhammad Ali stood holding fire that would symbolically wash away the complexities and contradictions, leaving only the essential truth of human persistence. Ali had known this moment was coming for 3 hours, ever since Janet Evans had passed the torch in the bowels of the stadium. 3 hours of knowing that the eyes of the world would be focused on his deteriorated condition, watching for signs of weakness, measuring the distance between the man he had been and the man he had become. 3 hours of wondering if his body would cooperate long enough to complete the simple act of lighting a flame. But in those same 3 hours, something else had crystallized in his mind. Every setback he had faced, the strip titles, the exile from boxing, the financial struggles, the gradual loss of physical capabilities, had been preparing him for this moment. Not the moment of lighting the Olympic flame, but the moment of demonstrating that dignity could coexist with vulnerability, that strength could manifest even in the presence of limitation. The Olympic Organizing Committee had kept its participation secret until the final moment, understanding that anticipation would only intensify the pressure on a man whose nervous system was already at war with itself. But now there was nowhere to hide, no possibility of substitution or delay. The ceremonial cauldron waited 30 feet away, its opening designed to receive the flame that would officially begin the games, and Ali was a bridge between intention and completion. Television directors around the world were making split-second decisions about how closely to focus on his trembling hands, how much of his struggle to show to billions of viewers who had tuned in expecting pageantry, and receiving instead something more authentic and infinitely more moving. The image of Muhammad Ali fighting his own body for control was already being transmitted across continents, creating a shared moment of human recognition that transcended nationality and sport. His left hand hung at his side, fingers twitching in the irregular patterns that had become familiar to those who loved him, a visible reminder of the neurological storm raging beneath his carefully composed exterior. The Muhammad Ali who had floated like a butterfly and stung like he existed now only in memory and footage, replaced by this more vulnerable version who moved through the world like a man walking through invisible water. But something else was happening in the stadium as the seconds stretched on. The crowd was beginning to understand that they weren't witnessing a ceremonial appearance by a faded celebrity, but something much rarer, a moment when courage became visible, when the essence of athletic greatness revealed itself to have nothing to do with physical dominance and everything to do with the refusal to surrender to circumstances beyond one's control. Young athletes in the crowd who had grown up hearing stories about Muhammad Ali's boxing prowess were seeing something that statistics and highlight reels could never convey. The source of the determination that had made him champion. It wasn't the fast hands or the footwork or the ability to absorb punishment. It was this, the willingness to continue fighting even when the opponent was his own body, even when victory was measured not in knockouts, but in the simple completion of basic tasks. But his eyes still held the fire that had burned through 3 decades of athletic and political controversy. Behind the physical limitations imposed by progressive disease, the essential Ali remained intact, the part of him that had refused to step forward when his name was called for military induction, the part that had absorbed punishment from George Foreman until exhaustion made victory possible, the part that had declared himself the greatest when no one else believed it was true. The torch in his hand was designed to burn for exactly 15 minutes, meaning he had been carrying active fire for nearly 6 minutes already. 6 minutes of managing not just his own physical limitations, but the emotional weight of representing something larger than himself. This wasn't just an athlete lighting a flame. This was America's complicated relationship with its most controversial sporting hero finally reaching resolution through the simple act of shared human witness. Television commentators around the world were struggling to find words for what they were seeing. The prepared script about Olympic ceremony and athletic achievement seemed inadequate in the face of something this raw, this unscripted, this dependent on the courage of a single individual fighting battles that most people would never face. They were watching greatness redefined in real time, watching a legend demonstrate that heroism could evolve, could adapt, could find new forms when the old forms were no longer available. For 30 years, the country had struggled to reconcile its feelings about Muhammad Ali, the boxer who had entertained them with his skill and showmanship, the activist who had challenged their assumptions about patriotism and military service, the symbol who had forced uncomfortable conversations about race and religion, and the right of athletes to have opinions beyond their sports. Tonight, all of that complexity was being distilled into a single moment of shared humanity that transcended politics and reduced every previous controversy to background noise. The steps leading to the cauldron platform stretched ahead of him like a mountain path, each one requiring careful negotiation between his intention to move and his body's imperfect response to that intention. The Parkinsons made every motion unpredictable, transforming simple actions into complex negotiations between will and physiology. But Ali had been fighting impossible battles his entire life, and this was simply one more, perhaps the most important one. In the television broadcast booth, veteran sports announcers who had covered Ali's greatest fights found themselves rendered almost speechless by the drama unfolding in slow motion below them. This wasn't the explosive violence of boxing or the speed of track and field. This was something quieter but equally compelling. The drama of human persistence played out on the most public stage imaginable. He lifted his right foot and placed it on the first step. The crowd's collective intake of breath was audible even 30 feet above them. 85,000 people suddenly aware that they were witnessing something unrehearsable, unguaranteed, dependent entirely on the determination of a man whose determination had already been tested in ways most people could never imagine. The sound of his foot connecting with the steps seemed to echo through the stadium's architecture, a small percussion note that marked the beginning of what everyone understood might be the most important journey of Ali's life. Each step would be a victory, each moment a maintained battle and a triumph over progressive disease that had been stealing his coordination one day at a time for more than a decade. The second step came easier, his body finding a rhythm that worked with rather than against the tremors. The torch flame danced in the evening breeze, casting moving shadows across his face that made him look like a figure from ancient mythology, a hero completing one final quest against odds that would have stopped a lesser man years earlier. Around the world, in living rooms and sports bars and public squares where crowds had gathered to watch the Olympic opening ceremony, people were leaning forward in their chairs, unconsciously holding their breath as if their collective could somehow help stabilize the trembling torch in Ali's hand. This had become something more than entertainment. It had become a shared meditation on courage and limitation, and the possibility of transcendence through simple persistence. Third step, fourth step. The platform was closer now, the Olympic cauldrons opening visible and waiting like a destination that had been 36 years in the making. Behind him, he could feel the weight of global attention, billions of people in hundreds of countries watching through television screens as Muhammad Ali carried fire toward fire, carrying the hopes of an Olympic Games that had been marketed as a celebration of human athletic achievement. In the VIP section, former opponents and rivals who had shared rings with Ali in his prime watched with expressions of awe and recognition. They understood better than anyone what it meant to see this man refuse to quit, because they had experienced firsthand the impossible determination that had made him champion. They were watching the same essential quality that had made him great in boxing, the absolute refusal to surrender, manifesting in a completely different context. But this transcended athletics. This was about the refusal to surrender, about the difference between being defeated and being finished, about the possibility that greatness could manifest differently across the various stages of a single extraordinary life. The Ali who had tormented Sonny Liston with psychological warfare was gone. The Ali who had absorbed George Foreman's best punches until exhaustion made victory possible was gone. But the Ali who refused to quit, who found ways to transform limitation into triumph, who understood that sometimes the greatest victories required accepting help rather than rejecting it, that Ali remained. The final step brought him to the platform level where the Olympic cauldron waited, its base designed to receive the flame he carried. His hand was shaking more noticeably now, the tremors amplified by fatigue and emotional intensity, but his grip on the torch handle remained secure. Everything his body was experiencing, the involuntary movements, the unpredictable muscle responses, the sense of fighting a war against his own nervous system, was visible to anyone with eyes to see it. And yet, somehow this vulnerability made the moment more powerful rather than less. The Muhammad Ali who proclaimed his own greatness with unshakable confidence had been magnificent. But this Muhammad Ali, fighting his own limitations in full view of the world while still managing to complete his mission, was something different, something more universal, something that spoke to everyone who had ever struggled against circumstances beyond their control. The torch met the cauldron's opening, and flame met flame. The Olympic fire erupted in a controlled explosion of light and heat that illuminated the entire stadium, turning night into artificial day for several seconds. 85,000 people erupted in applause that seemed to shake the concrete structure itself, their voices joining in celebration not just of athletic achievement, but human persistence, of the refusal to accept defeat even when defeat seemed inevitable. Ali stepped back from the cauldron, the torch still in his trembling hand, and looked out over a crowd that was giving him something he had never experienced before, unconditional love from his own country. The controversy was over. The arguments were finished. The debates about patriotism and protest and the proper role of athletes in society had been resolved not through words, but through this simple act of lighting a flame despite every reason to believe his body might not cooperate. The man who had once declared himself the greatest was discovering that his actual greatest moment might be this one. Not a victory in the ring, not a defiant stand against authority, but quiet demonstration that greatness could evolve, could adapt, could find new forms even when the old forms were no longer available. As he made his way down from the platform, the Olympic flame burning behind him, Muhammad Ali was no longer just a boxer or an activist or a symbol. He was something simpler and more profound, a human being who had refused to quit,